I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Have you put on some pandemic pounds? Many of us have. Experts disagree about the best way to lose weight. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Nutrition may seem cut and dried, but people get very emotional about their diets. Even scientists can get excited about interpreting the data.
An overview in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition has stirred up controversy. That's because the authors suggest that we need a better paradigm than calories in versus calories out.
The distinguished scientists propose that when we eat too many highly processed carb-rich foods, insulin goes into overdrive and stores fat.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, challenging dietary dogma on obesity.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, a new Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2 is starting to spread around the U.S. It's called AY42 and has been dubbed Delta Plus. This subvariant of the Delta coronavirus is spreading in the U.K., making up over 11% of cases there. It's also been isolated in dozens of other countries. Now the Delta Plus variant is spreading in the U.S. At least 8 states are reporting cases, and it's expected to spread even faster than the original Delta variant. How worrisome is this variant of a variant? British public health authorities suggest it may be more transmissible than Delta, but it's still responsive to the available vaccines. At the moment, people who've caught the new Delta variant do not appear to get sicker than those already suffering from previous COVID infections. Needless to say, the CDC is tracking the emergence of the Delta Plus subvariant very closely to make sure it doesn't develop into something more worrisome.
Ivermectin is a critical antiparasitic medicine for the prevention and treatment of river blindness. This disease, known as onchocerciasis, is caused by a parasite transmitted by a black fly in Africa and Latin America. Ivermectin not only changed the face of onchocerciasis, it also prevents heartworm from killing dogs in the U.S. As helpful as ivermectin is against a range of parasites, it has also become highly controversial in the fight against COVID-19. Many people believe it's the answer to controlling the coronavirus. Mainstream medicine remains skeptical, however.
Scientists from the UK have just submitted a preprint on ivermectin. It follows the retraction of their previous meta-analysis that reported positive results. The reason for the retraction was that some of the studies in the original analysis turned out to be fraudulent. Others were poorly conducted or biased and therefore untrustworthy. They came from countries like Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Argentina, and Turkey. The new meta-analysis of ivermectin states that the data available to support the use of ivermectin for COVID-19 is not reliable. Once the authors eliminated the fraudulent or questionable research, they found that ivermectin results in a non-significant 4% increase in survival. They conclude, these observations demonstrate that the significant effect of ivermectin on survival was dependent on the inclusion of studies with a high risk of bias or potential medical fraud. Before public health authorities can recommend ivermectin for routine use against COVID-19, they'll need a large, well-controlled clinical trial demonstrating its effectiveness.
COVID-19 causes a wide range of symptoms, including loss of taste and smell, shortness of breath, fatigue, fever, headache, body aches, and digestive tract upset. A new study shows that the coronavirus also infects cells inside the ear. This explains why symptoms such as tinnitus, dizziness, and hearing loss occur after infection. The researchers recommend that doctors pay close attention to the possibility of hearing loss, ringing in the ears, or balance disturbances in COVID patients.
Researchers have been interested in the possible effectiveness of zinc for preventing or treating SARS-CoV-2. An international team of investigators reviewed the medical research on this topic. Although trials of zinc against COVID-19 are in process, the results have not yet been published. However, the scientists analyzed 28 randomized controlled trials covering more than 5,000 participants. The studies tested a variety of zinc formulations and doses against common respiratory tract infections, mostly colds. People who took zinc as a preventative were less likely to come down with sniffles and sneezes. The number needed to treat was 20. According to the reviewers, taking zinc under the tongue or as a nasal spray once symptoms began shortened illness duration by about 2 days. There were no serious adverse reactions, though zinc can cause nausea, vomiting, and irritation of the mouth or nose. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Have you gained weight over the course of the pandemic? If so, you're not alone. A survey from the American Psychological Association found that 42% of adults reported gaining weight, an average of about 29 pounds. Did people snack more due to anxiety or boredom? Or did the type of food they were eating encourage weight gain?
To learn more about current scientific thinking on weight gain, we turn to Dr. David Ludwig. He's an endocrinologist, researcher, and professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and professor of nutrition at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig also co-directs the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Ludwig is the lead author of a recent article in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition challenging dietary dogma on obesity. His books include the bestseller, Always Hungry?
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. David Ludwig.
Great to be back with you again.
Dr. Ludwig, you and your incredibly distinguished expert colleagues have written this amazing article called The Carbohydrate Insulin Model, a Physiological Perspective on the Obesity Pandemic in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And we'll talk about what you have written about in that journal article in a moment. But first, the obesity pandemic. I think COVID reintroduced us to the challenges of obesity, but there are all kinds of health consequences. Can you just share with us briefly what some of them are?
Well, we certainly know and your audience well knows the long-term complications of obesity. Unfortunately, we're entering a new sort of twin pandemic where we know that based on new data from the Centers for Disease Control, that people cooped up for a year in their homes, a lot of stress, not sleeping well, social isolation, are more susceptible to weight gain, especially children over the last year, have shown a rate of weight gain twice what it was before the pandemic. And before the pandemic, it was already bad. So we're reaching unprecedented levels of obesity. And conversely, obesity predisposes to COVID-19 susceptibility and severity. Next to extreme old age, obesity and the metabolic dysfunction that goes along with it makes people more likely to get symptoms of COVID, and if they get COVID, wind up in the hospital or in the intensive care unit. So new approaches to obesity will potentially help both pandemics.
I'm tempted to ask you about the metabolic consequences of obesity, which you just mentioned, but I think instead I would like to ask you about what new approaches do we have?
Well, for basically a century, the approach to obesity has been based on a law of physics called energy conservation. In other words, weight gain only occurs when you take in more calories than you burn. In other words, when you overeat. And weight loss can only occur when you have a negative energy balance, fewer calories in than out. This is true, but we argue in our new paper that it's not at all helpful and it's not practical. Let's consider a different medical condition, fever. You could conceptualize fever as a problem of heat balance, rather than energy balance, heat balance, that the only way for temperature to increase is if the body generates more heat than it dissipates. It's true, but it's obvious. We don't need to keep restating that in public health guidelines. What we need to know is how to treat fever. Why is the body wanting to be a higher temperature in fever? And that's the same issue in obesity. What's triggering the body to want to gain weight? And that's the key issue which a focus on energy balance may distract from. And in addition, it's practically impossible to utilize this notion of energy balance in real life. Without elaborate laboratory equipment, there's no way for a person to accurately estimate energy balance within 350 calories a day. If you were off in the positive direction by 350 calories a day, you'd gain about 30 or 40 pounds over a year, hundreds of pounds in a decade. And finally, if energy balance were so important to controlling body weight, how did humans ever manage to avoid increasing obesity year after year before the very notion of the calorie was invented 150 years ago?
Well, I think for decades, nutrition experts, registered dietitians, health professionals of a variety of sorts encouraged people to keep track of their calories, how much they were putting into their body. And the goal was if you could, make that equation, calories in versus calories out, balance out so that you were taking in fewer, then you were going to lose weight. And obviously, we haven't made any progress. In fact, we're backtracking.
Counting calories is hard.
So tell us about the carbohydrate insulin model, which is in part in the title of your article, and why that is a much more important way of thinking about obesity.
Right. Counting calories is considering that the body is just susceptible to the law of physics and isn't a biological system. In other words, we're not just a passive calorie storage depot. We respond. When calories are restricted, we get hungry, and the body goes into calorie saving mode. Metabolic rate drops. So what we need to do is not just consider the law of energy conservation. We have to ask what is cause versus effect. And this law of energy balance doesn't tell us anything about that. So one possibility in cause and effect is that overeating, taking in more calories than you burn, is driving excessive fat storage in the body. That's the common way of thinking about it. But there's another way of thinking about it, which is completely consistent with the law of physics too, but it reverses cause and effect. And it says that when the body gets triggered to store excessive calories, in other words, when fat cells begin to take in and hold on to too many calories, there's too few calories for the rest of the body, and that makes us hungry, that makes us overeat. So the opposite way of thinking about this is that the body's process of storing excessive fat makes us overeat. And so that might sound a little radical or surprising, provocative, but let's consider what happens in other states of growth. Like, let's take the adolescent growth spurt. We know a teenage boy might consume hundreds or 1,000 calories more a day than he used to, and he's growing really quickly. But which comes first? Does that overeating make the adolescent grow quickly? Or does the rapid growth with the body taking up calories for new tissue make the adolescent hungry and eat more? Well, it's obviously the latter. How do we know that? Well, neither you nor I will grow any taller no matter how much we overeat. So this is really clear in growth. It's also the same is true for a pregnant woman. The fetus is taking up calories, growing, and making the woman eat more. It's not that the pregnant woman eating more makes the fetus grow. And we believe that this metaphor, this alternative cause and effect formulation, will lead us to more effective treatments for obesity because it will target the cause of overeating rather than the symptom.
So if the cause of overeating is the body storing more energy in fat cells, what makes the body store more energy in fat cells?
Well, that's the key question. And that's been an area of research for maybe 100 years. In fact, nothing about this new approach that we're describing as the carbohydrate insulin model conflicts with any basic findings in the research laboratory. Many factors can affect how fat cells in the body store calories. But chief among them is the hormone insulin. And, we kind of intuitively know this, that insulin is I've called it the miracle grow for your fat cells. When someone with diabetes starts taking insulin, one of the most common side effects is excessive weight gain. In laboratory animals, you give them moderate doses of insulin and they'll get hungry and eat more. They'll gain weight. And even if you restrict their food intake to that of a control animal, it will still gain excessive amounts of fat at the expense of lean tissue. So the carbohydrate insulin model argues that there are, many factors in our environment, in our life that are triggering fat cells to hoard too many calories, but chief among them are the processed carbohydrates that flooded our diet during the low-fat years of the 80s, 90s, and the first decade of this century. The refined grains, white rice, white bread, potato products, cookies, crackers, all of those low-fat treats that were supposed to help us control our weight because they had less fat, and of course, the sugary beverages. These foods digest into sugar in the body literally within minutes of eating them, sending insulin higher than it would ever go among people eating more natural diets. And that insulin, together with some other hormonal changes, causes more of the calories that we eat to wind up in fat cells, and there are fewer calories for the muscle, the metabolic organs in the brain, and that's why we get hungry, and that's why we overeat, to replace those calories being siphoned off into fat cells. And just eating less doesn't solve the problem. It just ultimately makes us hungry, and that's why we know very few people can sustain low-calorie diets for more than a few weeks or months.
You're listening to Dr. David Ludwig, professor at Harvard Medical School and Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig co-directs the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He's the lead author of a recent article in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and he's author of Always Hungry?
After the break, why has the energy balance model persisted so long without strong evidence to support it?
Dr. Ludwig describes the research findings when low-fat and low-carb diets are compared.
If people overeat because the body is storing too much fat, what triggers that fat storage?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This podcast is made possible in part by CocoVia, maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements. Cocoflavanols are among the most well-studied plant-based nutrients, backed by 20 years of scientific research.
CocoVia Cardio Health is available in capsules or powder, providing 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols daily. This supports better blood flow and vascular performance.
CocoVia also offers Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols. This product is backed by 4 different clinical studies demonstrating significant improvement in several aspects of memory.
From now through November 20th, People's Pharmacy listeners can get 15% off any order at cocovia.com. Discount code PPCVSALE15 is valid for single bulk or subscription orders of any CocoVia product. That's PP for People's Pharmacy, PPCV for CocoVia, Sale 15. PPCV, Sale 15 at cocovia.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products developed in Germany and made in the USA. KAYABiotics.com.
Also by CocoVia, offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols in powder and capsule form. More information at cocovia.com.
Today, we're talking about how science explains obesity. For decades, experts have talked about calories in versus calories out. The idea is that if you consume more energy than you expend, you'll get fat. If you keep on doing that, you'll become obese. It's known as the energy balance model. Does it explain why so many of us are gaining weight? Or does the carbohydrate insulin model offer an alternative way of understanding obesity?
Our guest is Dr. David Ludwig, professor at Harvard Medical School and Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig co-directs the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He's the lead author of a recent article in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, challenging dietary dogma on obesity. His latest book is Always Hungry?
Dr. Ludwig, why do you think the energy balance model, the calories in, calories out model, has persisted and predominated for so long without any really good data to support it?
There's an appeal to the notion of just eat less, move more. It's very simple. Just take in fewer calories, exercise more, and you'll lose weight. And of course, that does work initially, but the body is a dynamic system which responds to calorie restriction, and it responds in predictable ways. After a few weeks of calorie restriction, sometimes just a few hours of calorie restriction, if you look around at how frequently people are snacking, we get hungry. And hunger is not a fleeting feeling. It's a primal biological signal that the body wants more fuel. Now, maybe a few people who are super disciplined can ignore their hunger for the long term, but even if you do, the body fights back in other ways, most notably by slowing metabolic rate, making the body more efficient so that those calories become harder and harder to burn off the longer we restrict them. We could go back to the metaphor of fever. If you think of fever as just a problem of heat balance, too much heat in the body, not enough heat out, well, there's a simple solution. If you have COVID and a fever, get into the shower, get into a cold shower, and that cold water is going to suck heat out of your body. And of course, it would work if you could convince somebody with a fever to get into the shower, but the body's going to fight back in predictable ways. Severe shivering, blood vessel constriction, and you're going to feel miserable, and you're going to want out of that shower soon. As soon as you get out, your body temperature is going to shoot right up. Now, fever works on a different time frame. I mean, that's something that we can control for minutes or hours. We can't control our temperature for days, weeks, or months. In terms of weight, yes, we can control it for weeks or months, but it's very difficult to control weight that way for the long term, and the data are unequivocal. Very few people who go on a low-calorie diet, just restricting calories, keep the weight off after a year. And oftentimes this yo-yo process causes a lot of harm in the process, both to our bodies and also to our emotions and our psychology. We need a way of treating the drivers of obesity and weight gain beyond just thinking that it's a matter of discipline, self-control, and willpower.
Dr. Ludwig, when we spoke with you before, you described your very exciting research testing low-fat versus low-carb diets. And I know that you have followed up on this research, but would you just summarize for us briefly what you found when you tested in, people who were eager to sign up for your research? What did you find about the effects of a low-fat versus a low-carb diet? And then would you share with us also the recent results that you've gotten from this research about how it affects our blood lipids?
Right. One prediction from the carbohydrate insulin model is that if you cut back carbohydrates, the processed carbohydrates, not necessarily get rid of, fruits and non-starchy vegetables and beans and such, but the rapidly digesting, highly processed, what we call high glycemic index carbohydrates. If we cut those back and we replace them with high-fat foods, so olive oil, nuts and nut butters, full-fat dairy, and the like, that's going to have a metabolic benefit. You'll lower insulin. More calories that you eat will be available to be burned in your muscle rather than stored in fat. And what we'll see is metabolic rate speeds up. And if you're trying to lose weight, a fast metabolism is one of your best friends. So we tested that in one of the largest feeding studies ever done of this issue. We took 164 adults who were at least moderately overweight, fed them all their meals for a full academic year. This was done in collaboration with Framingham State University. First brought their weight down by 10%, and then put them on low, moderate, or high-carb diets for 5 months, feeding them more or less calories to keep their weight exactly the same. And we found that those on the low-carb diet, even though they had the same weight, their calorie burn, their metabolic rate, was about 200 calories a day faster than those on the high-carb diet. So this provides both a conceptual support for the carbohydrate insulin model and an encouraging possibility for dieters that the kinds of foods you eat can affect the number of calories you burn. So it's not just about eating less and moving more. We just published a follow-up from that very same study where we looked at the lipid effects. One concern with low-carb diets is that they're high in saturated fat, and we know that typically high saturated fat diets raise LDL cholesterol, and that's a risk factor for heart disease. What we don't know is if you eat a lot of saturated fat while you're also cutting back processed carbs, what might happen. That's what we looked at. And we found that the low-carb diet in this study, even though the saturated fat was 21%, so that's 3 times the saturated fat on the high-carb diet, 7%, that the low-carb diet did not adversely affect LDL cholesterol. It didn't raise it. And it had benefits for a whole range of other heart disease risk factors related to insulin resistance, such as triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, and a very important, although under-recognized risk factor called Lp(a).
Well, Dr. Ludwig, stop there. Pause, because we have been fascinated with lipoprotein A, Lp(a), for 3 or 4 decades. It is the underappreciated lipid. It's rarely measured by health professionals, and yet it's responsible for maybe 20% of the heart attacks and other cardiovascular complications. And statins, they don't lower Lp(a), they actually raise Lp(a), which seems like driving with your foot on the brake and the gas at the same time. So tell us again why Lp(a) is so important and why the low-carb diet made such an impact. I mean, it was impressive. Your research really knocked our socks off.
Well, thank you. You're right. Lp(a) is underappreciated and rarely measured because it's not thought to be affected by diet, and there are as yet no widely available effective drugs for it. And there may be down the road, but we know that all of these drugs have side effects. Lp(a) is thought to be genetically determined, and if you just happen to have high Lp(a), you're unlucky. And as you mentioned, it's a significant contributor to cardiovascular disease like LDL cholesterol is for people eating high-carb diets. What we found, and it's actually consistent with some smaller studies that have been previously published, is that by cutting back on carbohydrates, you can lower LP little a. Now, we didn't, the effect wasn't massive. There's about a 15 to 20% difference between the low carb and the high carb diet. But for some people who may be especially sensitive, their LP little a decreased by 30 or 40% on the low carb diet. And so, this may be a new weapon that we have against a range of cardiovascular disease risk factors. Reducing fat, low-fat diets lower LDL cholesterol, but they tend to harm a range of other risk factors related to insulin resistance. Cutting back processed carbohydrates really doesn't have a downside. You don't have to go down to these very low ketogenic diet levels where you're getting rid of even, fruits and vegetables. Just at 20 or 25%, which lets you have a serving or two of fruit a day, some beans, even a serving of whole grains, seems to have no adverse effect on LDL cholesterol, but benefits across the board through this range of other risk factors that comprise what we know as the metabolic syndrome, and LP little a, which sort of stands by itself.
Dr. Ludwig, you've pointed out that the energy balance model probably would work great if we were calorimeters, if we were machines, but we're biological organisms, and moreover, we're psychological organisms as well. So food has meaning, and people develop reward responses in their brains to certain types of food. I believe you also have a recent publication about how a high-carb diet compared to a low-carb diet affects certain people's response to those food cues. Am I mistaken?
Right. We had a recent study looking at how low-carb and high-carb diets affect brain pathways involved in the pleasure response, reward, and what's called the hedonic experience. It's both liking, but more importantly, wanting food. And that has a lot to do with cravings, food cravings, which many people on a low-calorie diet experience. So it takes us back to the critical question of cause and effect. We always want to treat a disease as close as possible to the cause, because then if you treat the cause, the body takes care of itself. If you treat a symptom, the body fights back. And if the carbohydrate insulin model is substantially right, and it's possible that both of these models are partially correct, but if to some degree the foods are triggering the body to store too many calories, and that hunger, food cravings are the body's way of getting you to eat more to solve that problem. What's the problem? That there aren't enough calories in the bloodstream to make the brain happy. So if we just focus on calorie restriction, we set up a battle between mind and metabolism. We're not going to win. The brain has all sorts of ways to get us to do what it wants us to do. Hunger is one of them. Food cravings is another. And slowing down metabolism is a third way. But if we plug the drain that's siphoning off too many calories in fat cells, well, we slow that drive to excessive weight gain, but we at the same time do something very fundamentally important. We keep more calories available to the rest of the body, so you stay full longer after eating. Hunger returns sooner. You actually get more satisfaction out of eating. Lastly, I'll just say, food cravings don't really increase our enjoyment of eating that much. We get intense pleasure for the 2 or 3 minutes that we're eating the bagel, the processed carbohydrates, the sugary dessert. But 5 or 10 minutes later, that enjoyment has waned, and for the next few hours, we might feel poorly. So treating the cause of the problem, and if the carbohydrate insulin model is right, that cause is hormonal and metabolic. It's not just restricting calories. We'll take care of the problem in a much more natural way.
So, Dr. Ludwig, if we were going to enroll in one of your studies or come to the Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital, or if our listeners who say, yeah, during the pandemic, I did in fact gain 5, 10, maybe as much as 15 pounds, help me overcome this problem. I'd like to lose that spare tire. What are the practical tips if I were to be part of your study that would make a difference over the course of the next 6 months?
Right. Obviously without providing medical advice, and there are bona fide medical conditions that can lead to obesity. So anybody who is really struggling, should discuss this with their healthcare practitioner. But the first step is to be gentle with ourselves. Recognize that body weight is controlled biologically, just like breathing, body temperature, and a whole host of other functions are controlled. Some people are more susceptible because of their genes, but we don't want to blame ourselves. Our culture has really done a number on people, saying that if you can't control your weight, it's your fault that you're fat. And so I think that this alternative view really helps to remove that stigma. We can view obesity as just another biological challenge. And the next step is, in terms of diet, to cut back on the processed carbohydrates. Doesn't mean people need to go on a ketogenic or extremely low carb diet. We just cut back on the white bread, white rice, potato products, cookies, crackers, all those low-fat processed foods, and the sugary drinks that flooded our diet during the low-fat years. Cut back on those, but don't just leave a vacuum. Replace those calories with delicious, healthy, high-fat foods. Nuts and nut butters, full-fat dairy, rich sauces and spreads, even real dark chocolate. By doing this, you're going to lower insulin. You're going to cause less surges and crashes in blood sugar and fuels in the bloodstream. And to the degree that this approach works with your body, you'll feel less hungry. You'll feel more satisfied. You'll feel fewer cravings. And it will be easier for you to lose weight with less struggle.
Well, any diet that includes dark chocolate is okay in my book.
And we also want to get enough protein. That's another topic that we probably don't have time for today, but that can vary. But protein will never be 50% of your calories. The body can't handle that much. But we may do well with a bit more protein than people typically eat, which could be plant-based or animal-based. Unfortunately, some of these diet debates take on ethical and environmental, implications. But this needn't be about, carnivore versus vegan.
Dr. Ludwig, you've mentioned full-fat dairy a couple of times. And I fear that Americans have been conditioned to avoid full-fat dairy. They've been told, in fact, the American Heart Association, if we were to go to their webpage right now, they would say, no, skim milk, or what they call light milk, non-fat food products. That's what you need to eat. And so if you go to the dairy counter, the dairy, what do you call it, Terry? The dairy...
Well, whatever it is, it's a shelf with yogurt on it.
It's in the supermarket where all the yogurt and all the milk products are. What you find is a tremendous number of low-fat yogurts, very few full-fat yogurts. You see a lot of skim milk, not a lot of full-fat milk.
And these low-fat yogurts are, generally speaking, flavored. So they've got a lot of sugar in them.
Right. They've got jam and jelly, basically, included in them. And so how do we find full-fat dairy?
It does seem obvious from one level that if you just take out the fat from dairy, there'll be fewer calories. You eat fat-free milk, fat-free dairy products, and it'll be easier to lose weight. But things really haven't worked out that way, because at the same time you cut back calories, you cut back satiety. People feel less satisfied and less filled from these thin milks. I remember in grade school, these pale, almost taking on a blue tinge. So the kid who might have 50 years ago drank a glass of whole milk and had 2 or 3 cookies, today that child has fat-free milk and 4, 5, or 6 cookies, which is a bad trade-off. Between the fat and dairy and sugar, the sugar has much worse effects both on our body weight and probably our cardiovascular disease risk factors. Yes, lots of saturated fat on a high-carb diet isn't so good for the body, but when you take out the processed carbohydrates, the saturated fat appears to be less harmful and really quite neutral. And the problem is the dairy aisle is filled with these low-fat products that, it's not that you even have to go out and eat the 4, 5, or 6 cookies. The sugar's already added into it. So that's a bad combination. And we won't even, we haven't even addressed the ways that all of these hyper-sweetened foods are keeping people's taste buds in a sort of infantilized state. So ultimately, the food industry is supply and demand. If people start demanding high-quality whole dairy foods without the sugar, they'll supply them. It's easy to find in Europe. Unfortunately, it is more difficult to find in the U.S. But we need to start asking for them and recognizing that that these highly adulterated, low-fat dairy products haven't taken us where we wanted to go.
Dr. Ludwig, we've mostly been thinking about adults, but as a pediatrician, I am sure that you spend a lot of your time thinking about children and weight problems. What advice do you have for parents?
The first step, as we discussed a while ago, is to think of body weight issues as a medical problem rather than a lack of self-control, poor discipline, or even a character issue, as is so often the case. Children who are heavy today face endless abuse and bullying. Imagine, how difficult it is for an adult, even an adult, with the images of ideal beauty out there as being ever thinner, even as our country is getting heavier and heavier. And that culture affects children even more. So many children wind up in the doctor's office, if they have a weight issue, almost frozen, that they've tried to lose weight by cutting back calories. That's only made them hungry and feel miserable. They've been blamed for the problem. So, how could they feel at all optimistic or hopeful about the doctor's visit? So the first step is to try to destigmatize the process, reassure the child and the family that it's not anybody's fault, that we're going to look at this as a medical issue and try to address the drivers of excess weight gain, which mostly can be addressed. As we discussed, the carbohydrate insulin model offers a different way of thinking about the problem. It's that the body, when it's triggered to store too much fat by modern, highly processed, high carbohydrate foods, that's going to ultimately cause you to feel hunger, and cutting back calories won't be the answer. We need to address the cause of obesity and excessive fat storage at its source, and the problems can then be much more easily addressed.
Well, one of the problems, of course, is that the foods that we have come to love, that have become so much a part of our diet, are those high-carb foods. I mean, pizza. You turn on television and you see those ads for the latest, greatest pizza with extra special crust and more cheese and lots of pepperoni, and then, of course, pasta, and then crackers and cookies and cake. And so teenagers in particular are really exposed to an awful lot of highly processed carbs when they get together with their friends. How do we help them overcome what has become the food industry's go-to marketplace?
Well, let's consider 2 more steps. So the first step was to destigmatize weight problems, that it's not your fault if you're fat, even though the culture tends to give you that message. This is a biological problem, like many others that doctors deal with, that are a combination of underlying biological issues and also behavior. So that's the first step. The second step is to understand how foods affect the body, and that these highly processed carbohydrates may be triggering changes in our metabolism, just affected by hormones, that are undermining our attempts to lose weight. Yes, we need to understand that, just cause and effect, teaching biology to our patients. And once that's done, then I think we can create alliances between parents and children rather than the food fights that so typically occur where the parents are yelling at the kids and criticizing the kids for overeating, and the kids are sneaking foods and ignoring it. But if we can get the parents and the kids to work together, we can begin by creating almost a bubble of protection for the family. This is step 3. And that becomes much easier when a child feels the weight of stigma lifted off of their backs, that they're not going to be blamed by their parents, and they're not going to blame themselves for the problem. So we work to figure out ways that a family in our modern toxic environment can protect itself, how we can fill the home with nutritious, whole foods that are going to be delicious, but also healthful and weight supporting. And then the 4th step is a long-term one, which is changing the culture. Once families have raised their consciousness, once we all individually begin moving in the direction of health and demanding that the food industry make healthier foods available, and we put our money where our mouth is. We only buy the healthy foods. We don't buy the junk. The food industry and ultimately the culture will change. This is, of course, a long-term prospect.
Dr. Ludwig, I'm wondering if you have any idea why the diet wars between the doctors and the researchers and the registered dietitians and everybody else who's got an opinion, even the patients, why are the diet wars so emotional?
Well, we all eat. It's one of those medical issues that we all experience multiple times a day, in its practical manifestations, what we eat, what we choose to eat, how often. And unfortunately, according to the article that we've recently published in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, all too often treatment has been focused on symptoms. Overeating, excessive hunger, we argue, is a symptom of an underlying issue, that the body's tendency to store excessive fat. We're not focused on the solution. So when you're focused on symptoms, there could be 100 different approaches. Cut back calories with low fat, or paleo, or vegan, or this or that. But by improving our understanding of these underlying drivers, it might take us to a more comprehensive view and an avenue toward consensus and agreement for how to move forward. The carbohydrate insulin model doesn't say it's all about carbohydrates. There are other foods that trigger too much insulin or can affect fat cells. There are aspects of our lifestyle and environment. Sleep deprivation, stress can affect fat cells directly rather than necessarily make us overeat per se. Even some of the toxins and pollutants in the environment, these so-called endocrine disruptors, directly influence fat cells. So by focusing on that, we can get a bigger picture and then hopefully understand how an individual can eat in a way that's consistent with his or her preferences, their culture. If that's going to be more plant-based, fine. If that's going to, be, more dairy or less dairy or gluten-free, that's all fine. As long as these approaches are informed by a deep understanding of the biology of obesity, they're going to be more effective. And there will be opportunities for people with different views to actually speak to each other and not just shout at each other.
Well, my final question is exactly that. You and your colleagues call for a constructive debate. What does that look like?
For better or for worse, I have a presence on social media. Your listeners can follow me at David Ludwig, MD on Twitter and Facebook. I try to interpret the science as I see it, and I am all too aware, directed at me and many others from both sides, from all sides of the diet wars, the tendency to attack opponents credibility, their integrity, rather than the logic of their argument. It's totally fine to argue with somebody's interpretation of the data or how they might translate that to a public health or a clinical message. But we really have to get out of this unfortunate tendency that we see in politics and religion, but it's also pervading science, to think of the opponent as somehow ill-motivated, that they're intentionally trying to confuse people. Mostly that's not the case. It's mostly that people have different views, and that to reach a greater truth, we have to dialogue with our opponent. I mean, that's might be difficult to do in politics today, but that is ultimately going to be the answer. And we certainly should apply that concept to science.
What fascinates me, Dr. Ludwig, is how much of the recommendations from the nutrition establishment, whatever we mean when we say that, was based on beliefs rather than actual data. And what you've done is you've actually created experiments where you controlled what people ate. A lot of the other studies have been based on what people thought their subjects were eating or what their subjects were reporting on a diet survey, but you actually controlled what people were putting in their mouths. It would seem to me that most health professionals should be looking forward to data rather than, we just thought it would work that way. We thought the calories in, calories out made sense, but now we've got science and there's a different way of thinking about it. Why has that been so hard for your colleagues to accept?
Well, we do like to think that our studies are rigorous and well-controlled, but we're certainly not the only group conducting rigorous, well-controlled nutrition research. There have been wonderful studies dating back decades, thousands of studies. I think the problem isn't with the basic science per se. It's with how they get interpreted into public health and into the clinic. I think one point that we do make is that we can't rely on very short studies of 1 or 2 weeks where you change nutrients radically are not directly translatable because it takes the body a while to adapt. It's like, think of, taking a group of out-of-shape, middle-aged men sitting around watching TV all day long and putting them into military boot camp where they're doing track and field and climbing walls and such for 6 or 8 hours a day. After a week or two, they would be miserable. Their muscles would be sore and inflamed, and their exercise tolerance might be worse. But that doesn't mean that vigorous fitness training is bad for you. It just means we need longer assessment periods. Come back in 6 months and they'll be in great shape. So we need a little more sophistication in how we interpret the studies. And I also believe that the carbohydrate insulin model, the foundations of the thinking there, that it's a biological issue of excessive fat storage that's driving overeating, that this reflects the basic science dating back a century better than the standard energy balance, calorie in, calorie out approach. Because if it were just a matter of eating, the notion here is that it's all of the tasty, energy dense foods around us that's causing the problem. Well, we know energy density isn't the big problem. If it were, the low-fat diet should have worked because low-fat diets are much lower in calories per bite. Low-fat diets didn't work despite the low energy density. And it's hard to think that the problem is just palatability, that we have too much tasty food. I mean, is America leading the world in obesity because we have the world's tastiest cuisine? I think the French, the Italians, and the Japanese might debate that possibility.
Dr. David Ludwig, thank you ever so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. David Ludwig, endocrinologist and researcher. He's professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and professor of nutrition at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard. Dr. Ludwig co-directs the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He's the lead author of a recent article in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and author of Always Hungry?
After the break, we turn to Dr. Ludwig's colleague, Dr. Walter Willett.
As a nutritional epidemiologist, what does Dr. Willett think about the possible shift in paradigm regarding obesity?
Nutritionists have long recommended low-fat dairy products like skim milk instead of full-fat products like half and half. What difference does it make?
What food choices can we make to reduce our risks of disease and obesity?
We also talk about lentils. Can we get adequate nutrition from a plant-based diet?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic supplements. These supplements are made in the USA with high-quality, sustainably sourced ingredients.
Originally developed in Germany, Kaya Biotics offers 3 different formulations with 15 carefully selected strains of bacteria. These are designed to increase the diversity of your gut flora and support your immune system. More information at kayabiotics.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia, now offering its cardio health powder with 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, microencapsulated organic hypoallergenic probiotic products developed in Germany and made in the USA. KAYABiotics.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
It can be tough to change a scientific paradigm. Health professionals have been leaning into the calories in, calories out energy balance model for a very long time. Embracing the carbohydrate insulin model could be difficult. To get a different perspective, we're reaching out to an old friend of the People's Pharmacy. He's also one of the authors of the recent paper published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Challenging Dietary Dogma.
We turn now to Dr. Walter Willett, professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He served as chair of the Department of Nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health for 25 years. Dr. Willett is the author of several books, including Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Walter Willett.
Well, nice to talk to you, and it's really good to hear your voice again.
Dr. Willett, you are arguably one of the world's foremost epidemiologists and nutrition experts. We've been talking to you for decades, and I have to say, this perspective that you have signed on to in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, the carbohydrate insulin model, a physiological perspective on the obesity pandemic, has really caught our attention. Tell us how you got involved in this publication.
Well, this issue isn't exactly new, but I think this is, as you mentioned, this is really getting into the physiology of what we think is probably important for helping us control our weights at a healthy level. We have known for quite a while, although I don't think it's been fully appreciated, that the quality of our diet, not just the total calories, is likely to make it easier for us to maintain a healthy weight. And that's in an environment that's doing a lot to help us gain weight. So we need all the help we can get. And paying attention to diet quality is important. And this is a hypothesis. There's quite a bit of evidence to support it, but it deserves some further study, some further investigation. Physiologic explanation for why diet quality is so important.
Well, one of the reasons that we're thinking about this perspective is the obesity epidemic. And we hear a lot about it in the U.S. and around the world. What can you tell us about it?
Well, the obesity epidemic is truly a very serious issue. It will probably make the coronavirus pandemic look like a small blip 10 or 20 years from now. Obesity rates are increasing in the United States. If we go back to 1970, about 10% of American adults were obese. Now it's 42%. We thought about a decade ago we might be seeing a little plateauing, but it looks like that was just a fairly transient phenomena, and this unrelenting increase is back with us again, up to 42%, and it doesn't look like there's any suggestion it will stopping. That was before the pandemic. There's lots of indication that the pandemic has accelerated this increase. As you suggest, this is going on in most countries around the world. It's not just the United States, but it's important to keep in mind there are some exceptions. Japan, for example, has been much less affected. In Japanese women, for example, the obesity rate has been about 5% over the same period, and it's actually gone down slightly. It's gone up a little bit in Japanese men, but way below the U.S. And it's not just due to being in Asia. In France and in Italy, the increase, there was some increase, but that seems to have plateaued for a number of years now. They do seem to be plateauing at a much lower rate of obesity than we have. So that's important because this is not an inevitable epidemic.
So, Dr. Willett, as a nutritional epidemiologist, I'm sure you have some hypotheses about why these trends are different in different places. Could you share them with us, please?
Well, we have some hypotheses, but in general, we've not had a formal study of comparing potential causes or explanations for the obesity epidemic in different countries. The first, long time ago, people said, well, it's because Japanese have low fat in their diets. But that wasn't a really good explanation because the European countries that have relatively low rates of obesity have percentage of calories from fat fairly similar to the U.S. And in Japan, their dietary fat is actually greatly increased over this period of time. It's actually pretty similar in macronutrient composition as it is in the United States. So that percentage of calories from fat doesn't seem to be the explanation. This has been studied a lot, and it's just not the explanation. Diet quality may be better in those other countries. And one of the explanations my personal explanation is that diet quality is very important, but also the issue of mindfulness, paying attention to what we eat and valuing dietary quality is very important. For instance, in Japan, it really has been the most successful country. There is a culture of, first of all, a view that people should not be overweight or obese. So there is some social pressure. That's pretty clear. But then people have developed an eating environment that supports not overeating. Food is served in small portion sizes, and there's a lot of emphasis on quality, not quantity, as it is in the United States. This deserves further attention, but there's, I think, quite a bit of evidence that paying attention to the quality of the diet and valuing that above volume is very important.
Well, you mentioned fat, and we talked with Dr. Ludwig earlier about the fat-free craze of the 80s and 90s and how that didn't seem to help us very much. I grew up on a dairy farm. My uncle would always have full-fat milk and full-fat everything because there was no low-fat when I was growing up. And I think you had some experience on a dairy farm as well. I'm wondering if by following that path, that is to say the low-fat everything path, we were misguided. And I have a story of someone this is a gentleman who loved half and half or cream in his coffee. I mean, that was one of the few little delights in his life. And then with the full fat phenomenon being, a no-no, he switched to skim milk, continues to do that, but doesn't really enjoy it. Is he kidding himself that he's doing something good by substituting skim milk for half and half?
Well, as you say, Joe, that we do share a background in dairy. Our families were dairy farmers for 5 generations, and I grew up in my early years on a dairy farm. It was actually a research dairy farm, but clearly 5 glasses a day was what we were told to drink in Wisconsin, and I think I did that growing up. And as you say, most of the time it was not skim milk or even low-fat milk. So I think in terms of weight control, there's not good evidence that switching to low-fat milk was really beneficial for weight control. There still is an issue with too much dairy fat, though, and I think it's important that we, while we are focusing on the carbohydrate aspect here, and it's very clear now that lots of refined starch and sugar are not good for us, that doesn't mean that loading up on a lot of animal fat is good for us either. We do have to remember that coronary heart disease mortality rates were about 5 times higher during that period than they are now. So reducing dairy fat, but not replacing it with sugar is what's important. The important thing is to mainly replace that with healthy fats, like the liquid plant oils. So for your friend who is worried about what he put in his coffee, actually, I don't think that's very important because the quantities there are not very much. If you're at a tablespoon or so of full fat milk or versus skim milk, from a health standpoint, that's almost for sure not going to make any difference. And if he really enjoys what he's putting into his coffee, I say go with what you enjoy, but pay attention to the whole diet in an important way. That's what's most important.
Dr. Willett, I'd like to ask you how we should do that. After all, weight control is very important, but it's not the only goal. We also want to lower our risk of heart disease and diabetes and cancer and all the other chronic conditions that seem to be so prevalent. What food choices can we make to reduce our risks?
Well, you're absolutely right, and it's important to remind ourselves and everybody that weight control is very important for health, but also the quality of our diet has major impact on our rates of diabetes, coronary heart disease, and other important conditions. And some people sort of debate whether which is more important, our weight or the quality of our diet. And there's 2 aspects to answering that. One is that these are intertwined. As we were just talking about, the quality of the diet does help us control weight. We have a lot of evidence for that now. But even separate or independent from effects on weight, the quality of our diet is very important for controlling these other aspects. And we can go into detail, but basically a high-quality diet means focusing on healthy fats, which mainly liquid plant oils, healthy forms of carbohydrate, meaning primarily whole grains, and fruits and vegetables, nuts and legumes for protein sources, along with, if you like, modest amounts of meat and dairy products.
Dr. Willett, you and your wife were very kind in submitting a recipe for lentil nut loaf with red pepper sauce for a book that we wrote many years ago called Recipes and Remedies. Why are you so fond of lentils? And by the way, it is a fabulous recipe.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed that. I think there are 2 main reasons for having more plant sources of protein in our diet. The first is planetary health. And even though I've spent my life on research about diet and health, at this point in time, I have to acknowledge that planetary health is actually more important because we are on an accelerating way on a path that will really destroy the health of our planet. And there can't be human health without planetary health. So if we don't get that right, and climate change is really the most important factor, there are other factors too that are important, but as you certainly know from the latest reports, we are very much on a path that is leading to devastation globally from climate change if we don't make changes quickly. So our diet is not the only thing that we can do about that. Getting off of fossil fuels is most important. But even if we do that, if we continue on a global basis eating as much animal protein as we eat now, and many countries are still increasing their amounts of animal protein, if we continue on that, we still can't stay within planetary boundaries for climate change. So planetary health is very important, but also replacing red meat with plant sources of protein such as legumes, beans, soy products, and nuts will have a very important benefit for human health months and just a few years from now. We're not for generations into the future. So there's double payoff here, planetary health and human health, by replacing a good bit, not necessarily 100% replacement, but replacing a good bit of our animal proteins with plant sources of protein.
Well, you raised a really important point, and that has to do with, balancing protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And a lot of people have been hearing, and certainly Dr. Ludwig was suggesting, that a low-carb approach makes sense. But I think that there are a lot of folks who think that vegetarians or vegans can't get enough protein. Can you explain briefly why we can get adequate protein from plants and how you go about doing that personally?
Sure. That concern about adequate protein in vegetarian or vegan diets has been a concern that's been raised. But we definitely, especially as adults, can get adequate protein from plant sources. It's often overlooked that even something like rice and wheat, which are usually considered carbohydrates, still have roughly 10 or sometimes as much as 15% protein in them. And then the sources we think about, nuts, legumes, and including soy products, have very good amounts of protein. And whole civilizations have developed that primarily get their protein sources from some combination of grains and legumes. So it's there's really not much of a problem at all. If we study vegan populations, there's really no evidence that they have protein deficiency. We do have to pay attention to diet quality if we want to be a vegan. And I should mention that we would not get enough vitamin B12 and a few other B vitamins, so it is important to take some supplements or fortified food, but protein is not a limiting factor. I co-chaired the Eat Lancet Commission, which was charged with finding dietary patterns that were consistent with planetary health and human health. We reviewed the world's literature, food group by food group, and in the end, it really boils down to something pretty simple. I call it 1 + 1, and most people can manage that. That's sources of animal protein per day that go along with vegetables sources of protein, and that's 1 serving of dairy a day and 1 other source of animal protein, such as about once a week, a serving of red meat, chicken a couple of times, fish a couple of times, and some eggs. That 1 + 1 is very easy to follow. And that's pretty much what I do. It's been called a flexitarian diet by some because there's a lot of flexibility. You can be a vegan if you want to. You can have these modest amounts of protein. And there's thousands of ways of putting that together. But in the end, it boils down to something pretty simple.
Dr. Walter Willett, what are the consequences of the obesity epidemic?
We've been looking at the relationship between overweight, obesity, and risk of many diseases for several decades now. And it's clear that overweight and obesity are related to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, some cancers, and many other conditions. And so now what's happening is this epidemic where we have 42% obese in the United States, many more people overweight as well. We're starting the generations that became overweight and obese as children and adolescents are now moving into middle age. And what we're seeing is that the major decline in coronary heart disease mortality, which had been going down for decades, has plateaued and is now going up in younger groups. Also, obesity-related cancers that had been coming down for years are now going up in the younger generations. There's every reason to believe those reversals of trends will continue on as those younger adults go through their life course. And it means that decades of progress in health is being reversed and wiped out. Very serious. And of course, in the end, this translates into life expectancy as well. Even before the COVID pandemic, we had seen life expectancy going down over the last few years in the United States. There are multiple factors. The opioid epidemic was feeding into that, but obesity and overweight were clearly an underlying driving factor as well. So the trends are already going downward. We've really entered, I think, with just what I've called a death spiral. And this will continue if we don't make some major changes.
And Dr. Willett, I was fascinated to hear you say that countries like France, Italy, Japan have not had the same obesity epidemic that we have had here in the United States and in some other countries. And yet those countries are known to like things like pasta in Italy and noodles in Japan. So it's not like they've cut out carbohydrates. What do you think is a little different there and their relationship to carbohydrates compared to our relationship?
Yes, it's interesting that we don't have to eliminate carbohydrates to have healthy diets and control our weights. It is important that the quantity is not as large. If you order pasta in Italy, for example, it will not be this huge mountain on your plate. It will be a side dish, and there'll be lots of vegetables and perhaps some other things with it. If you're really out for a treat, you can have a truffle. But so the amount and is very important. And it is interesting that pasta and noodles actually have a lower glycemic index than most of the carbohydrates, like bread that we consume in our diets. Japan has reduced the amount of carbohydrate, reduced the percentage of calories from carbohydrate quite a bit during this period. But again, they pay a lot of attention to amounts and the quality of their diet, not just looking for heaping plates.
Dr. Willett, you shared with us many, many years ago that the food industry has had a profound impact on thought leaders, even some of your colleagues in academia. And I'm just wondering, has that at all changed, or has the food industry continued to influence a lot of our thinking and behavior?
The food industry, of course, can't be regarded just as monolithic. There are parts of the food industry that, especially in recent years, have appreciated and realized that there's a business opportunity in having healthy and sustainable foods. And so there are many more choices out there now. The healthy and sustainable part of the food industry, I think, is the only part of the food industry that is growing at this point in time. But still, some of the big traditional players out there are pushing their products that are undermining our health and well-being. And they, as we talked about some years ago, they spend billions of dollars a year trying to seduce us into buying their products, which are, for the most part, refined starch and sugar.
You've suggested that mindfulness could be an important factor in helping us assess the quality of our diet and appreciate it. Give us just another idea of how we could put that into practice.
Well, the reality is that so much of the time we're busy, we're occupied with other things. Unfortunately, Americans spend, on average, a few years ago, I don't know what the latest number was, 29 hours a week in front of a television. And food is often in front of us, it's around us all the time, and we're consuming that without really thinking, without really appreciating it, without paying attention to the quality. So again, we need more research in this area, but I think there's strong reasons to believe that this is an important factor in helping us control our calories. And I should say calories, we're more than calories, the quality of the diet as well as the calories.
Dr. Walter Willett, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
A pleasure to be with you again. Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Walter Willett. He's professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. He served as chair of the Department of Nutrition for 25 years. His books include Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wardarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia, the maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Kaya Biotics, microencapsulated organic hypoallergenic probiotic products developed in Germany and made in the USA. KAYABiotics.com.
Today's show is number 1279. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website on Monday mornings. This week's show offers a bonus segment with each of our guests. Dr. Ludwig offers advice for parents, and Dr. Walter Willett suggests how we can use mindfulness to choose better diets.
If you'd like to add a comment about this show, look for the post on our website. Enter your comment at the bottom of the show notes for $12.79 under the podcast tab.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to our newsletter, you'll also have regular access to our weekly podcast and find out ahead of time which topics we'll be covering. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week.